Bon dia. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of the conference, especially Sarah, my old friend since many years. She used to be my student in Amsterdam 20 years ago. And especially also the organizers of the conference for all the work they have done. I would like also to thank Chris for his magnificent initiative to found Gadat already after so many sessions. And I hope this one and only initiative to organize critical discourse analysis internationally will have a long life next year, in 2 years in Budapest, and many years to come. I'm glad to be here, and I'm very glad to be invited to be able to talk this morning in this plenary talk. And I would like to tell you a little bit about my current work on knowledge and discourse, and also the work I'm trying to do in this new book on discourse and knowledge, which already I'm trying to write for many years, and I hope to have at least one first version this summer. But probably the final version won't be until next year. And since I have talked already a little bit about this topic 4 years ago at Gadat in Britain, and also a few months ago in Loughborough at the Conference on Discourse Analysis, what I would like to do today is to relate this work on epistemic discourse analysis with critical discourse analysis. This is, until now, mostly a theoretical endeavor. So I don't have specific data to report, but I would like to sketch a theoretical framework to do some kind of critical epistemic discourse analysis, which goes beyond the work I've been doing, especially also on ideology. And of course, ideology is a central notion in critical discourse analysis. But I would like to convince you today that not only ideology is central in critical discourse analysis, but also knowledge. And of course, those of you who have read, most of you have read Foucault, know that already. But now we have to see how exactly this functions, not only in a general philosophical way, but also in a specific empirical study of how knowledge is managed, controlled, and reproduced in discourse. That's the main thing I would like to do today. So let me first summarize in a few minutes what I understand by epistemic discourse analysis. So epistemic discourse analysis is first of all something which is multidisciplinary. So I'm not talking here only about language and discourse, but also about cognition, social cognition, society, and culture. When I talk about knowledge, it's all over the humanities and the social sciences. So that is the first important thing. So the first step for us in discourse analysis is to know how knowledge is expressed, presupposed, and reproduced by discourse and its structures. So it's the main task of people in discourse analysis. Second, in philosophy, we would like to know how the justification of knowledge, which is a central notion of epistemology, how that is also managed by discourse. I mean, many people in epistemology forget that the way we acquire knowledge is usually through discourse. And within epistemology, which is very strange, there is no systematic study of the way knowledge is acquired by discourse. So I think that's also a very important thing we, as discourse analysts, can contribute to philosophy. Then, of course, in psychology, as you well know already, for more than 30 years, we have been working on what the role is of knowledge in the production and the comprehension of discourse. So what kind of mental processes are involved in the production and comprehension of discourse, and what is the role of knowledge in these mental processes. And in social psychology, we need to make one step more, and we would like to know how this particular kind of knowledge is reproduced within a group. So it's not just individual processing, but this is specifically what happens in social groups, how social groups share knowledge. That's very important. So it's not only one individual understanding a discourse or producing a discourse, but this whole social groups. The notion of identity, things of social identity, they are also related to discourse. And in society, of course, we need to know how knowledge is reproduced through social systems, how it is reproduced in institutions, how it is reproduced in what we could call epistemic communities. And also this notion in society is not just some kind of sociology of discourse, but a sociology of knowledge. It's also a sociology of the role of discourse in this particular kind of social reproduction of knowledge. And finally, let's say in anthropology, we also would like to know what the role is of discourse and knowledge in the reproduction of culture. Because many definitions of culture, as you well know, define culture in terms of the shared knowledge every competent member of the culture must have. But again, this is not something which people acquire in an automatic way. It's again learned in a culture through discourse of parents and cultural institutions. So these are the main dimensions of epistemic discourse analysis. Now before we continue, we'd like to know what knowledge is in the first place. The classical definition of knowledge is justified true beliefs. So if you go to epistemology and you ask what knowledge is, then the old-fashioned definition is justified true beliefs. I won't follow that classical definition. For me, justified true beliefs is a problem because especially the notion of truth, and especially absolute truth, is really a problem. So instead of having this kind of classical definition of knowledge, I prefer to work with a notion which is more pragmatic, more relinked to how actual discourse works in different kind of communities. So the notion I use of knowledge is more relative. It's relative to epistemic communities. So what is knowledge? Not in universal or metaphysical terms, but what is knowledge for people? How people actually in specific communities work with knowledge, what they presuppose as being true. That's fundamental. So what is knowledge in the Middle Ages for us now can be something like false beliefs or simply an ideology. So knowledge is relative to epistemic communities. For them it is true, but for people outside of the epistemic community, it may be just false belief or ideology. That's very fundamental. But crucial is how it functions for them as knowledge, and not just as some kind of belief. And not only it's relative, it's also contextual. Let's say even within the same epistemic community, people sometimes think this is the way things are. For example, scholar. Within the scholarly community will say this is how things are, but in a more informal community will accept also other definitions of the situation. So it is contextual. In some kind of context things are true, which in other contexts in the same epistemic community are not exactly like that. So knowledge is relative and it is contextual. By the way, many people in epistemology don't like that. Classical people in epistemology don't like the relativity of truth. Then truth is truth. It's not something you can negotiate about. Then the next thing we need to know not only is what knowledge is, theoretically and philosophically speaking, but also that knowledge is something which goes on here. It has to do very fundamentally with cognition. Knowledge is not in discourse, knowledge is not in society, knowledge is essentially here. It's in the minds of people, and not just of one person, so it's not something individual. It's nothing personal, baby, as they would say in American movies. It is something which is socially shared, so fundamentally see. But before we can study this kind of social cognition, we have to know about how it is being represented in memory. So we now know, since many years, that if we do an analysis of discourse in a cognitive perspective, and how we study the actual processing of discourse, knowledge plays a very fundamental role. We know that since the beginning of the 1970s, with first work in artificial intelligence, and then also through all kinds of experiments in cognitive psychology. So most of these things you can find on this big schema, and I'm not going to comment in detail. The schema number 3. If you have an idea, this is more or less the schema. This is more or less what we now know about the production and the processing of discourse in the mind. So I would like to emphasize that the basis of all this processing of discourse, and not only of discourse, but also of other social practices, is knowledge. I emphasize this because when I started to write my book on ideology 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, together with many other people in critical discourse analysis, we had this idea that all the basis of discourse is ideological. You know, when you talk in society, you have to assume that all knowledge is ideological. At the end of that book, but only at the end, I realized that is not true. Before you have ideology, you have to knowledge in the first place. You cannot have ideological conceptions of, for example, immigration or minorities or fascist organization before you actually know what they are. So you need to know first before you can have ideologies. So ideologies are of specific groups within this big epistemic community. So in the epistemic community, you have all kinds of ideological different groups which have different opinions about many kind of things. So the basis of ideology, also see in the schema, is knowledge. So the lower part of the schema, that's all socially shared. So knowledge, norms and values, ideologies are socially shared. Ideology, more specifically by specific ideological groups, feminist, racist, anti-racist, socialists, and so on and so on. So these are of ideological groups within the same epistemic community. They can communicate. They can talk among each other, even when they don't agree about your opinions, but they can at least understand each other. And that presupposes shared knowledge. All right? Now, the top part of the schema is more individual. It's more specific. It's what you understand in each moment. These are the mental models. So when you do something or have done something this morning, for example, breakfast, you remember that, and that is a mental model. When you read an article in a newspaper, you create a mental model of that particular event you're reading about. So it's something semantic, and I call it, with Walter Kinch, a situation model. It is a mental model of the situation you were in personally, or about which you have read in the newspaper. So that's a situation model. It's more semantic. That was the state of affairs until more or less 83, when Johnson Laird, in his book on mental models, and Walter Kinch and I, in our book on strategies of discourse comprehension, that is what we thought about mental models until about 20 years ago. But I think that is not enough. What was missing in the psychology of text processing was precisely this notion of a context also. People not only have a representation of what they talk about, what they refer to, but they also have a representation of the communicative situation in which they participate. Each one of you now have a mental representation of us being here in the Universidade do Minho, in Braga, in Portugal, in this room, listening to me, and so on and so on. Each of you have a different kind of model of that communicative situation. And that particular kind of model I call a context model. A model of the context. So again, we already had a bit of debate yesterday in one of the sessions. A context is not something like an objective social situation. It's a subjective definition of the relevant aspect of the communicative situation. That is a mental model. And that mental model of the context influences discourse. Why and how discourse is appropriate or not. So, speech acts, politeness, appropriateness, all these pragmatic notions are controlled not by a social context, but by the subjective, personal definition of the situation as each of you participate in that particular kind of situation. That is a context model. Now, that is more or less what this system says. But the interesting thing is that one of the crucial aspects of the communicative situation as represented in the context models is knowledge. Not only each of you now know about the time and the place. We are here, that's why you have all these Dijk expressions like now, 9 so much, here in this university, and so on, but also you have an idea of who is here present as what. Each of you is here present as critical discourse analyst and all kinds of other now more or less relevant identities. And fundamental in this definition of the situation is also the kind of knowledge we now share. At each moment I'm speaking, I have to know for each new word, each new sentence, what I assume you to know already. If not, it will be totally inappropriate. If I'm going to repeat only things you already know, why speak? And if I don't presuppose all kinds of knowledge, it would be too technical, I cannot communicate either. So it's absolutely crucial that each moment I manage in my talk what I can say, what I can presuppose, what I have to explain, and so on and so on. So the management of knowledge in anyone speaking, in any conversation, in any kind of lecture, is this kind of management of knowledge. And that's absolutely crucial. So where is knowledge in this whole system? It's in the context model. It's in the context model. Each speaker has to manage all these kind of things. And then we get all these notions you know about. Common ground, presuppositions, and so on and so on. Common ground is one of the productions of this particular kind of mechanism in the context model, which I call a K-device, knowledge device. And this K-device calculates at each moment what the common ground is. And the common ground based on general genetic knowledge in society, in our epistemic community. It is also part in the common ground what we already have talked about before, previous intertextuality, what you have read in the newspaper before, what you have seen in the context, and of course, what you have just read or heard in the text. So common ground is always calculated at least three ways. Generic knowledge of the community, of the epistemic community. Second, it's contextual. It is what we know from all kinds of other situations before, intertextual, and it's textual. So these are the major notions of what the processing of discourse is all about. Now that is the cognitive center of the things, but of course not only that. We also need a more social cognitive approach, which is saying, yes, we have this particular kind of knowledge, but how is it being shared in the first place? How do we acquire it? Where does it come from? So the socio-cognitive approach will say, yes, now, how in society is this particular kind of knowledge acquired? How is it reproduced? To who tell you? How do we tell our things? So you have an experience, and somehow you tell it to your friends. And newspapers, they tell it to their readers, and so on. So we have to know what the processes are, empirically speaking, of how this knowledge is acquired in everyday life. And not only in interaction, so in social psychological, but also in a more societal macro perspective, we need to analyze how this particular knowledge is associated with specific kind of institutions. So newspapers, journals, schools, and so on, they are epistemic institutions. They are there to communicate knowledge specifically to other situations, to other people. So not only we need this cognitive aspect, and not only we need this socio-cognitive aspect, but also a sociological aspect, namely, what is the role of these epistemic institutions? And we know that a little bit already from the classical sociology of knowledge, which already exists many, many years. But we also now need to know what is the role of discourse in these epistemic institutions. What is the role exactly of discourse in the reproduction of knowledge through the newspaper, through schools, through textbooks, and so on. And then finally, of course, there's always this cultural dimension. So if we really talk about culture in terms of shared knowledge of an epistemic community, then we have to know how also these criteria of what knowledge is can be variable. So the classical notion of the justification of knowledge, for example, direct experience, observation, hearsay and knowledge. So how do you know? Usually in everyday life you say, I know because I was there, because I've seen it, I've heard it, and so on and so on. And also, how this knowledge is acquired, for example, through discourse. I know because John or Mary told me, or I've read it in the newspaper. Or else, third possibility, I know because it follows from something we already know, from inference. So the three sources of knowledge: direct experience, discourse, hearsay, or inference. There are three ways of knowing. Now, the interesting thing is that these particular kind of ways of knowing, justification criteria, they also show up in linguistics. If you look at the theory about evidentials, and we will hear about it more from you, these are also the notions which are fundamental for evidentials. So in different languages, you have different expressions to show that you know something from someone who told you that, or from your own experience. And even within certain languages, you can even distinguish between not only that you have just experienced it, but that you actually saw it, or that you actually heard it. Where seeing is the most direct and most vital thing, because here it can even be wrong, but if you see something, then it's really true. So the most strongest way of knowing is that you actually saw something. And it's also codified in many languages. So if we now not only look at all these different disciplines, but also at linguistics and discourse analysis, we know that in our own discipline we have these notions which also come in part from psychology, for example from Herb Clark, the notion of common ground, and how this common ground is construed from different kind of sources of knowledge, I've already mentioned. And if you want to have a look, what we now know in linguistics, in schema 1, you see what we now at this moment know in linguistics, at discourse analysis, about different kinds of knowledge. So I won't talk about this because it's more linguistics, and you know about these things already. So work on evidentials, I'm not going to summarize. Work on, for example, epistemic markers or expressions, not either. I'm not going to talk about modalities. The fact that if you express knowledge, you can do so in many ways. You can say that you are very sure about something, but you can use in English and many other languages all kinds of modal expression to say that is something probably true, or maybe true, and so on. So you can say perhaps, and many other expressions in many languages. I'm not going to talk about these things we already know, all right? One of the things I would like to mention briefly, because that is not so common, that is if you talk about knowledge, not only in psychology, but also I think in discourse, we should make a distinction between different kinds of knowledges. So there's not just one knowledge. Not only in the schema of the production of knowledge, we have seen how these things may be different, but I think it's essential that you, for example, and as you see that in schema 2, there are different kind of knowledge. You can say, well, there is, for example, my personal knowledge about something very specific I did this morning. For example, what I had for breakfast. That is something only I know. So it's purely non-shared, personal, episodic event knowledge. I was having this kind of thing for breakfast. No one else. And then I can tell to someone else, and then it's being shared. So that is already shared knowledge. And why is this important? Because in my discourse with this other person, I can then presuppose that particular kind of knowledge. My unique personal experience of knowledge, I can never presuppose. So there's a linguistic manifestation of that particular kind of knowledge. And it's the kind of knowledge you never can presuppose. You always have to tell first. You know, that's very important. You cannot presuppose your unique experience. When you tell to someone else, to a friend, for example, in the next conversation, you can simply presuppose, you remember I told you about these kind of things? You simply can presuppose what you told of a person's experience. And so on and so on. So you can have specific experiences, personal ones, interpersonal ones, within the family, and so on. Again, that will be presupposed. And then, of course, in the whole epistemic community. Things you know, for example, September 11 or about the economic crisis, we all know, and these things will be presupposed in all public discourse, not in personal stories. It will be presupposed in public discourse that we are now living, for example, in an economic crisis. It doesn't have to be asserted all the time. It's presupposed in all public knowledge. But that's event knowledge. These are all mental models. A mental model is always a representation of one specific event. It may be very complex, like an economic crisis or what you have for breakfast, but they're all mental models. And these for all persons a little bit different. Because your own experience in the economic crisis is a little bit different from other people. So your own mental model of the economic crisis is slightly different from other people. There is overlap, yes, of course. Now, this is all specific knowledge. And then on the other hand, you have generic knowledge. My generic knowledge about my teachers. but also our generic knowledge about our teachers, or what we have in common in our culture, and so on. And so you have always mental models as specific, subjective, variable, and things we have in common, which are shared, and which is social, and which is cultural. These two kinds of knowledge you always have to distinguish, but it's true at all levels. Personal, interpersonal, for a group, or for the whole epistemic community. So you see there are different kinds of knowledge. So this is more or less the basis of where we have to start when we do critical discourse analysis of knowledge and critical epistemic analysis. There is no such thing as yet, but I would like to at least open today some ideas, not very detailed yet, because it would need not only a paper but a whole book or more to do that, and I already have hard time to finish the general book about discourse and knowledge, let alone the application in critical discourse analysis. So this is still very tentative. Now, let's focus on some critical notions of critical discourse analysis. First of all, notions like power and power abuse, which I simply call domination. So power abuse is domination. All right, so notions, critical is domination. It is access. Who has access to knowledge, to discourse, is very fundamental. Notion of equality and inequality, that some people have more knowledge than other people, and so on is very fundamental. And of course the notions of interest, in whose interests things are being shared or not shared. So these are some critical, crucial notions being used in critical discourse analysis, which we can now try to apply when we also talk about knowledge and discourse, all right? And of course the notion of ideology. Because already, not only since Marx, but certainly since Mannheim and many others 60, 70, 80 years ago, this distinction between what is knowledge and what is ideology has been on the table all the time. And what we now try to do is, in this more contemporary theoretical framework, to work out how these things can be distinguished in the first place. Because what for us is knowledge, for other people may be ideology and vice versa. When people say black people are not as intelligent as white people, as you find in many scientific studies, for them it can be scientific knowledge. For us it can just be a racist ideology of superiority and so on. So it's very important that we have some kind of mechanism how to distinguish theoretically these kind of things, also in the critical analysis. So these notions are very important. So if, to begin with the very definition of knowledge, namely, knowledge is not just justified beliefs of an epistemic community according to the criteria I've mentioned of observation, observation, experience, discourse, hearsay, and inferences. The question then, of course, raises is, who controls these criteria? Who settles these particular kind of standards? I mean, what, and we know it also in methodology of science, is who controls what in specific kinds of community is accepted as the criteria of what is true or not true. And of course the whole theory of methodologies in science have to do with it particular kind of this. What is the kind of standards we accept as such? So for example, we have an error of so many percent is acceptable in the scholarly. Why? Why is 5% or something like this so relevant? But not only in science, but also in everyday life. If you go to court, what counts as acceptable evidence? If someone says he or she has seen, is that good enough? Well, depends if they have good eyesight or not. And they do all these kind of tests. You know, this kind of thing is for each situation against something which can be criticized. You can simply ask is, in whose interest, what kind of standards and criteria established as something which counts as knowledge in each situation, everyday life, in court, in science, in scholarship, and so on. So in all these situations we have to know who establishes these criteria or standards of what is true or not true. That's one thing. And that is the definition we talked about in epistemology and so on, but also in psychology itself. If we talk about knowledge in terms of the minds of people are quite different. You have people who have lots of knowledge, you have people who are experts and non-experts.
And these particular kind of things can also be seen in different perspectives from a critical point of view. So what kind of knowledge do you need to have in order to be able to participate? What kind of expert do you have to be? If, for example, in court they're going to ask someone to testify as an expert witness, what kind of expert do you accept? You know, so again, these are very critical questions. You can do critical law studies just analyzing the discourse of experts in court. You can work in education and see what kind of differences do you need to have among the students for them to accept or understand this particular kind of textbook. So again, this has to do with expert and non-expert knowledge, with lay knowledge and expert knowledge. Again, it's not a neutral difference. It is something which has specific kinds of critical questions which have to be answered first. And then the question of different kinds of cognitive resources people have, which you call knowledge, between experts and non-experts. And the interesting thing is that, for example, today in much of cognitive psychology, for example, in the work of Danielle McNamara, she shows that experts sometimes understand text worse than non-experts. Why would that be? That is because experts are so confident that they just go over text very quickly and not, you know, pay attention to details. So ask afterwards the experts what they have read. They make sometimes more errors than non-experts, which, you know, they really pay attention. So there's all kinds of interesting cognitive results which we can also apply in a more critical situation of what is this particular kind of expert knowledge? Does it mean, is there some kind of intellectual hierarchy? People have more resources, all this kind of question of intelligence as well. All these notions have a very important critical dimension which one should analyze. Another notion, now going on from this philosophical and the cognitive and social psychological, is again, we are talking about sharing knowledge. Therefore we have about, you know, knowledge communities and so on. How is knowledge being shared? But the question is, how do we do that? Is it just a question of learning about information through the newspaper or through textbooks and so on? But what about manipulation? Many of the things we learn is not just a neutral communication of knowledge, but it's a form of manipulating people. Most of the knowledge we know, for example, about the economic crisis, probably through all kinds of institutions, even maybe not intentionally, it has to do with the control of the mind. It has to do with the fact that we're not just neutrally learning, but we are being manipulated without knowing about it. So as soon as we have a control of our knowledge in the interest of the people who communicate this kind of thing and against our best interest, then we talk about manipulation and not just education or information. And then to the societal level, you see how I'm working, from the individual to the interpersonal, social psychological, to the sociological, now to the societal level is, what about these epistemic institutions we talked about? Media, schools, universities, and so on. What about these kind of knowledges which are being taught there? What is the difference between, for example, official knowledge and alternative knowledges? We see this now a lot on the internet about the economic crisis. We have the official analysis of the economic crisis in terms of banks and of countries which don't control and all kinds of other things, but there are many alternative explanations of the economic crisis which are not in the mainstream newspapers and mainstream forms of communication. Now we need to know what the relation is between official knowledge, which we learn in textbooks, and not so informal knowledge. I've been working a lot in my work on racism on textbooks, and I want to know, for example, what these textbooks say about immigration. Now, if you go to different countries, and I've seen these for Latin America and Europe, they tell different stories about immigrants and about minorities. I would like to know what is the official knowledge about them, and what is alternative knowledge. They're quite different. For example, textbooks, our textbooks in Portugal, in Spain, in Europe, in Latin America, hardly ever talk about the experience of immigrants and minorities with racism. Our racism is not something which is public knowledge. You won't find much about it in the newspaper, not much in political discourse, not much in textbooks. Why? Because we are being represented in a negative way. So about immigration problems, threats, and so on. We read a lot, but we don't read a lot about our problems, which are racism, discrimination, and prejudice. A little bit, but in toned down version. So, again, what is official knowledge about immigration and what is not so official knowledge? And not only for immigration, but also for sexism, the position of violence against women, the economic crisis. There are many kinds of knowledge we have, official knowledge about, and many kinds of alternative knowledges. So we need to do an analysis, systematic analysis of the curricula. We have to know what already many people have done, Michael Apple and many others. You have to know what is the relationship of official knowledge to the official curricula in school. What are the conditions for official exams? Again, curricula, textbooks, extend the old discourses. So we as critical discourse analysts, we can take each of these kind of things and analyze it. Now what is presupposed that people should know, and why should they know these particular kinds of things and not other things? Again, this is something we should somehow analyze systematically. Now, to finish, let me focus a little bit on the relationship between this notion of control, which is my definition of what power is all about. So power, I analyze usually in terms of control. So one group has power over another group if they can control the members of another group. But that's a very general notion. It's not just controlling what they can do or not do, which is control of their actions, but it's also control of their minds. Because if you control the minds of people, their mental models and their generic knowledge, then because the actions of people are based on their knowledge, you also indirectly control their actions. So the way you control the actions of other people and limit their freedom is first of all limit their mental models. Because people act on the basis of the mental models they have about situations. In the economic crisis and many other situations in everyday life. So crucial for us is to analyze how powerful organizations and institutions control public discourse, and how through this control of public discourse they control the mental models people create of the economic situation and many other situations in everyday life. That is what we need to know a little bit more about. Now, let me analyze it a little bit. The analysis of the control of discourse is always, at least in two ways. First of all, if you control discourse, you first of all have to control the context of discourse, in the way I just defined it. So it's not just controlling what people can say or not say, but it's the first step in the control of discourse is controlling the context of discourse. And what it means setting, where and when. So you control discourse if you can establish who is going to talk, not only, but also when and where. So one of the crucial ways of controlling discourse is the setting itself. Time and place. All these indexical things, these indexical orders, as someone already mentioned here, these are the things you can control as well. That's the first thing. The second thing, of course, you control in context is the participants in that particular communicative event. Who can participate and as what? So you can say you can participate, but you should not speak. You can only listen. You can participate, but you can speak, but only on that particular kind of topic, but not anything else. So, for example, someone in court is called as a witness, can only talk about specific kinds of things ordered by the judge. I give you an example from an old study of Ruth Wodak. Ruth Wodak, in an old paper, analyzed how people give testimony in court. And the interesting thing is that it depends on social class as well. The judge, for example, when there were just traffic violations, and a woman who was a lower class woman wanted to explain why she had parked her car like that. You know, just a personal story. The judge would not allow that. A middle class man, did the same kind of thing. The judge was simply listening to this personal story. So what I'm saying is that in specific kinds of situations, specific kind of people can communicate specific kind of personal experience, and other people are only allowed to talk about what exactly the judge tells you. And if you have many movies you have seen of scenes in court, there are specific kinds of rules, what you can say, what you cannot say. And how these things are being controlled is, of course, very important. And, of course, not only, because I already said, fundamental part of the context is not only time, place, participants, and the actions and the aims and so on and so on, but also the knowledge. So also you can control the knowledge. For example, you can only participate in this situation if you know such and such, for example, in exams. If you want to participate in classes in university, you have to have this particular kind of degree. So many of the conditions of the control of discourse is through the control of the knowledge of the participants in the first place. Now, this is the control of the context. And then, of course, you have the control of the text itself. So you have control of all the structures of discourse which somehow may control the mental models of the people. So specific kinds of topics being mentioned, and other topics, not I just mentioned the question of racism. So if you want to control people's minds, mental models, ideologies, general knowledge about, for example, racism, this is the way you talk about it, for example, in topics in discourse. Specific kinds of things are emphasized and other things are not emphasized. So somehow, through the control of specific structures in discourse, you can also control the mental models people have of specific situations. Now let me give you a few examples to start. Many of the things you already know. So first of all, you have specific preferred topics. So if we have, as I said, in much of my work the last 30 years of immigration, but there are many other studies many of you have done yourself, is that specific kinds of topics are preferred in discourse and others are not. So for example, if you talk about immigration, somehow it has to be associated with problems, with some kind of threat. You know, a threat of our culture, a threat of our territory, a threat of our neighborhood, a threat of our culture. You know, immigration is fundamentally, with, as people in a vague term use, framed in terms of a threat. All right, that's the thing, how it is being preferred. Now, if this somehow at all levels of discourse is the preferred topic, then because these are kind of things you typically represent in semantic macrostructures, which are shown in headlines, in leads in newspapers, or in summaries of scientific articles and so on, you know, the typical expressions of macrostructures. Now, if that is so in discourse, then most likely it also will happen in the mental models people have. What people later memorize is not the newspaper story. Usually people forget about it. Just ask people after seeing the news, after a few days, they don't remember. Well, what they do remember is the mental models. And the mental models are not just what they read in the newspaper, but what they also create through, as you see the system, through the knowledge they already have, and especially the ideologies they already have. So the mental model they create of what a specific story is, what they hear in a newspaper, or from a textbook, or from a teacher, or from their parents, on the one hand, plus all the inferences which come from the knowledge and the ideology they already have. All right, so this is the way they create. Even when things are not said in a newspaper, they can construe a mental model simply by reading between the lines, by making inferences which are not in the text, but which are based on the knowledge and ideology they already have. So the text itself might not be biased, but the mental model can be, based simply on the ideology people already have. Now, not only the representation in general, but also the whole perspective of the event. For example, if you describe immigration, you usually do that in newspaper, in political discourse, from our perspective, from the receiving country, from us, not from their perspective and their experience and why they come and so on. The perspective is also of the in-group, of us, and that, of course, already gives a bias to the representation of the events. You can, and the rest you know, because of the standard critical discourse analysis, you can represent, as we have seen from Teun and many other studies as well, you can represent actors in many ways. So you can represent people as heroes or as villains. You can represent them in many different ways through all the usual lexical, rhetorical means. You use metaphors. So if you want to emphasize the negative aspect, you use the typical metaphors, and that's why immigrants, how do they arrive in our country? By boat, by plane? No, they come in waves. They come in waves. They always come in waves. Immigrants, minorities, refugees, they come in waves, avalanches, and so on and so on. So, again, why? Because if they come in waves, it's somehow, as you know from metaphor theory, because these things are more concrete. It has to do with embodied sensations. It has to do, if they come in waves, you feel ground. All right, this fundamental idea, they come not in many, they come in waves, especially when you live in Holland behind the dikes. It is something very, it is something very threatening. Somehow this kind of thing is, metaphors, as you well know, are extremely important to create mental models which are embodied. Mental models have to do with experience, have to do with mental models are multimodal. They're not abstract. A mental model is how somehow we have experienced kind of things. We now know from many psychologists today, these also are representing different parts of our brain. Visual aspects, aspects of fear, emotional aspects, things of many aspects of multimodal experience. That is what a mental model is all about. And if you have metaphors, they just impinge directly on the multimodal aspects of these mental models. So this is how you control these kind of things. Now, there's much more to say, but summarizing in a few words, it goes like this. First of all, I would like to convince you to read a lot about knowledge. Because I think we can learn a lot about this because we have been reading so much on ideology. But there is much to learn from, from reading about knowledge, first of all. So to do epistemic discourse analysis, first of all. Second, this is not just linguistic. It's not just linguistic theories of knowledge we know about, epistemics and all kinds of other things, evidentials and so on. It's important, but it's not enough. Knowledge is multidisciplinary. You have to see it from different kind of perspectives to really understand how things go. A cultural aspect, a social aspect, a cognitive aspect, it is multidisciplinary. Now, if you have this kind of multidisciplinary epistemic discourse analysis, now you have a good basis and good instruments to do a critical epistemic discourse analysis. And you can say, now, let us now review all these things, from cognitive to the socio-cultural. And you will see that at all levels and dimensions you need specific critical notions. You can see, what about access? Who has access to this kind of knowledge? Who controls the epistemic institution? Who has access to the minds of other people? Many of the notions, which are also now in neuropsychology very important. Theory of mind, all these kind of things, fascinating. But many of them also have critical dimensions which have to do with power, with inequality, in whose interest things are being communicated. What are the biased criteria of the communication of knowledge? There is much more to do, but it's not more time. Thank you.